Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this video, I want to show another use for Yupo paper. You may have used it with alcohol inks, but it's actually possible to watercolor on it as well. Today, I'm working on the heavyweight white Yupo. This is 144 pound weight and very opaque. I'm also using Core watercolors, Q-O-R, which I love. And I'm going to activate my palette with a spray bottle first. And then just play for a minute so you can get a little bit of a feel for how the watercolor works on the Yupo surface and how it moves and reacts. And this is really the best way to get to know any medium, just playing and experimenting with it and trying out different things. So you can see that the paint reacts differently than it would on paper. There's not a lot of movement. The brush strokes show. And the colors are remaining pretty true unless you move them with the brush. And each brand of paint is going to react differently. Within a brand, you'll probably find certain colors that act differently than the others on this surface. So again, if this is a technique that interests you, take the time to play with the watercolor mediums that you have to see what works and what doesn't. The Yupo surface is not absorbent, so there are effects that you can create here that you can't on watercolor paper. And one of those is with splattering or spritzing water. I'm going to spritz water here, and you can see that clear water pushes the paint away and creates its own pattern in the painted area, and it will dry that way if you leave it alone. So that's a fun thing to experiment with too. Your dye-based sprays would be another interesting thing to try as well. I'm adding some more color and just mixing up some colors right on the Yupo. Usually I mix colors on my palette, but this surface gives you the opportunity to mix right on your project. So that might be something that you'd like to try. I sort of started with primary colors, so I have lots of possibilities for new colors just waiting to happen. Another fun thing to play with is rubbing alcohol. This is the 91% concentration, and this actually repels the watercolor and changes the surface tension. So you'll see it bead instantly when I spritz it, and then the beads sort of travel to find each other. And I'm going to speed that up so you can see it better. It's a really cool effect. Another thing I love about Yupo is being able to lift or wipe away paint that goes where I don't want it. I'm using a paper towel here on a wet area, and you can also use a damp brush to lift paint from a dry area. I let my practice piece dry, and you can see how the textures remained in my coloring. I decided I'd go ahead and use it for a card. So here's a bit of that process. I'm using StazOn ink here, which stamps beautifully on Yupo. Just know that if you use StazOn, you won't be able to do the alcohol spritzing because the alcohol will cause the ink to lift. There are some cases you may like that, and I'll show you what I mean a little later. You'll want to be sure the ink is fully dry before you paint, and you can either let it air dry or heat set it, but do be careful if you heat set. You'll want to hold your heat gun away from the paper and keep it in motion so you don't cause the Yupo to warp. So I'm just adding paint as I did before, and you'll see me use my water mister to add effects and also a paper towel to lift paint that I didn't want. This was kind of a long process, but I wanted to include the whole thing even though it's sped up. Maybe it'll help you to gain courage if this is something new to you. There really is a lot of just back and forth that happens, and I noticed too that I tend to dot paint in rather than brushing because that's a more predictable method for keeping paint where you want it. Here I spritzed a little water and then left that effect in the background and blended the darker areas back where I wanted more shading. And then I just did a lot of dotting to add in shadows, the insides of the flower and different parts of the bird. And then here is a real ew moment where I went way too bold with the color, but I was able to pull that back by lifting color with a paper towel. And that again is something that would not have been possible on watercolor paper. So if you're into making mistakes like me, you will find Yupo really forgiving in that regard. Here I'm using the paper towel to add texture to the painted area. You can use salt like you would on watercolor paper, and I didn't try the watercolor imprints technique, but I would think you could lay other objects onto it to add texture. You just would have a longer drying time than with watercolor paper since the water has to evaporate. I did use my heat tool to dry the painted areas a little bit. I wanted to add some darker shading there, and I wanted it to kind of stay on its own rather than bleeding into more wet paint. So that's why I did that there. So I'm pulling my background out a little more. I splattered a little paint and water onto the panel. And then as I finish up, you'll see me using the paper towel to wipe a clean border around the image. And there were a couple of areas where the paint had already dried, so I used a wet brush to reactivate those, and then I was able to wipe it clean. Here's my finished card. This stamp I used is from Inkadinkadoo, and I did fill in some lines on his head and beak with a Sharpie. I was able to die cut the Yupo pretty well with a square die, but I probably wouldn't try anything more intricate than that. I know I encouraged you to experiment, but I want you to learn from my mistakes too, so I'll share this card that was going to be so pretty for my tutorial. This is actually an older stamp, but this image has just been released by Whimsy Stamps, and I think it's beautiful. I stamped this with StazOn ink, and it was all going so well until I thought, that cloudy sky would be so pretty if I spritzed it with alcohol. So I did that. And you can see the instant reaction the alcohol had with the StazOn. But because of the artistic style of this image with all the stippling, that reaction actually enhanced a lot of the shading that was already there. So I just decided to pretend that I meant to do that and spritz the bottom part too. And then I just used my brush to move some of the black ink into my painted areas to add some more shading to the image. So as I said earlier, that is a reaction that will happen, but there are times that it may work for you. So as always, play around with the products that you have and learn how they work together. One other thing that I did, I wanted to use a fixative so my watercolor would not rub off the Yupo, and I sprayed the fixative too heavily, and that also reacted with the StazOn in some areas because it was too wet on the panel. So if you do use a fixative, hold the can away from the panel and just do real light, quick layers, and it'll be fine. That doesn't need to happen. You can see that some of the lines are fine. I just was being careless there. If you're wanting an ink that is compatible with water and alcohol on Yupo, I really recommend a hybrid ink. This one that I'm using here is branded by Impression Obsession, but any of the ones you see with this same pad shape are manufactured by Stuart Superior, and the hybrid ink formula is the same in all of them. If you have their palette ink, it's the same as well. So in this sample, I was able to spritz water into my paint, and I also worked with alcohol, and I didn't have any reaction with the ink at all. And that will be the same actually on regular cardstock as well. You can use these inks with watercolors, with pencils blended with solvents, and even with your alcohol markers. So here you can see the effect with the spritzed alcohol, and there's no bleeding of the ink at all, so I can play with all those pebbled effects in the background and add a little more texture to my bird here. And then I talked earlier about adding texture with other objects, so here I have a script stamp that I use a lot, and I'm going to use it to lift some of the wet paint and stamp it out into other areas. So I have a little scripty background there, in addition to whatever ink was left on that stamp from the last time. One more cool thing that I discovered on this sample is that you can even use pencils on Yupo. So I added in a few details here with this Sepia Polychromos pencil. That's an oil-based pencil, and I didn't try any other brands, but that may just be a tutorial for another day if you're interested. So here's that completed card, and all those stamps are from Impression Obsession. I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. I have covered a lot, but I hope you've got some new ideas to try out, and I hope this gives you more ways to use products you already have or that you've decided you need. Thank you so much for watching.